Have you ever thought about living with your friends in a communal village, spreading peace and love? Well, that's how hippies lived in big cities in America during the 1960s. In fact, according to an interview with a social historian at the University of Washington, the hippies' multiple legacies reshaped American culture with their distinct dislike towards authoritarian people and groups. So today I will be informing you what hippie culture was, who the people were, and how it impacted and took over the United States. I will go over the origins, the hippie cause, their demographics, and the Vietnam War. First, I will go over the origins of the hippie culture and how it started. What is hippie culture? To begin, known as hippie culture, it's a counterculture which condemned mainstream society for being conformist, uptight, and rule driven. By UW News. Hippie itself derives from hip, which means being up to date, fashionable, and opening one's eye. An article by UW News went on to explain the movement was not expressly religious, and life as a hippie was for people as a way to belong in a religion. Many people became hippies after having an experience with LSD, a psychedelic drug that causes hallucinations. Hippies were known for their unique styles of long hair, casual clothes in psychedelic colors. Males often grew beards, and both men and women wore sandals, beads, and rimless granny glasses. Women's clothing was often long floating dresses. Hippies came from white middle-class families and grew up in white suburbs. One of their first experiences with hippies or the hippie culture was at college. The hippie rejection to mainstream values was surprising to new adults because it was in direct contrast to what their parents believed in and taught them. Since most hippies dropped out of college, and it convinced other students to drop out and join the culture because it showed as a sign that something was wrong with the system. If people who benefited from college dropped out, then that means that something was wrong with something was out of loop here. Hippie culture also includes the philosophy of taking care of the earth through recycling, vegetarianism, forest preservation, and organic food. Hippies set up living quarters in big cities known as hippie districts or villages, and they often set up gardens, shops, music venues, and restaurants for cheap or free, and this was to establish cheap ways of living and alternative lifestyles. Now that we've learned about how hippies began and how young adults joined them, let's talk about the most impactful event in hippie culture. It was the Summer of Love. The Summer of Love actually took place in the summer of 1967, and it was launched as one of the most important widespread social and political gatherings. And it included over 100,000 people in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, which was a hippie village. But this wasn't just taking place in San Francisco. Time magazine reported that this hippie movement was spreading from and blooming from Boston to Seattle and from Detroit to New Orleans, with a total of over 300,000 people. And this also spread to Canada and Britain. Finally, let's see what hippie impact was on the Vietnam War. In a news site's Culture Trip, it states that the Vietnam War took place in the mid-1960s, where the United States government started a military surge to Vietnam to destabilize and destroy the communist North Vietnamese government. And the never-ending war and conflict, and the more that the men were drafted, put a strain on the trust that Americans had in the U.S. government. But why did the hippies get involved in the protests of the Vietnam War? According to History.com, hippies saw mainstream authority as the origin of all society's ills. This included war. They would join political radicals in their support for the civil rights movement and against the Vietnam War. Hippies instead held rallies and protests that was characterized by music, sex, drugs, vulgar language, and nudity. Other anti-war groups did not see this as a viable form of protest, and instead they saw it as unconventional because it didn't fit to their standards. But over time, visual defiance was accepted as a form of resistance, as stated by Britannica. Instead of hippies organizing themselves into a central organization, they would have individual groups organize marches and demonstrations. Although hippies themselves weren't primarily political, the Yippies were a group of hippies who were politically active and often set up political groups to join election ballots as a form of defiance. Finally, in October of 1967, hippies led by Abby Hoffman placed flowers in the gun barrels of soldiers guarding the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And this gesture was a form of a symbolic act that symbolized the victory of love over war. So, to wrap things up, let's review. Today, I informed you all about the movement and counterculture of the hippie culture. We went over what the culture was about, how others became a part of the group, the distinct summer of love, and the Vietnam War. Now that you've learned all about hippie culture, you can see that the hippie mentality manifested itself through environmentalism, communal living, and alternative culture. Thank you for listening to my speech.